had, I mean, the concern for us is it's not a high producer, but, you know, there's a lot of well there. And so our concern is, we can't tell where the water level is in the well, you know, so we have a garden, we do have put in some secondary containment things just as an emergency, but it's a scary thing. We don't know how the aquifer is, how our well is.
So somewhere between half a gallon and 1 gallon.
They went down Granite Road today, actually, and they have a slide on it, because we're unique.
Okay.
We're kind of on bedrock.
And our well, one of the things, our well has sulfur. No, but we use a big thing, you know, our filter to take it out. And we've had the water tested, if you're interested, we can show you the minerals and everything that's in it.
Cool, thanks. Anyone else want to introduce themselves before we get started formally?
Bob Chapman, resident from Squirrel Oak. We live right on the salt water. Have a shallow surface well that we use for drinking, which has been reliable for about 25 years. And another shallow well that we use for gardening. Two people, and here out of general curiosity, we don't know much about the water table in the area, and of course, it's concerned for the island population. If we increase our water usage, what's the basis for that, and what's that going to be our need?
Thank you. Great. Anyone else want to introduce yourselves? Where you live, what you're seeing?
How much was it for the water test? Was it expensive? Is it like $75?
I think it's 7,500.
Yeah, okay.
There's two types, Mark. You can get a real retail bill, which you got returns, you know, and certain minerals, you know, like I think they upwards of 300 for you know,
Okay,
every everything there.
yeah,
So when you go to chase everything.
okay,
The basic one will be 100, 115, 120.
okay. Yeah.
Great, well, I'm gonna suggest we get started, just so everybody knows, we've got people on Zoom participating, so, I am recording it as well. You might need to say approved right there. So, yeah, and we've got the cameras right here and the microphones right here, so it should hopefully track us. If you're online and you can't hear us, please feel free to let me know in the chat if there's any issues. I see Jess, you're on, admin, Richard, so anyone online, if you've got any problems hearing us throughout the day or seeing the screen, let us know. So looks like the system is working. Great, well, I will get up and get started. So thank you all for being here. Wonderful to have a nice group. My name is Sadhu. I'm with the Housing Society, and I'm really pleased to have been working on this with Mark Banesh, our regional director. This kind of for this work that we're doing, and this came out of a housing forum that we did a couple of years ago. And Max actually was one of the folks that said, "Hey, we really need to be thinking about the environment. We're talking about housing," and so that kind of sparked this whole inquiry into water supplies, and talked to Hornby, Gabriola, Quadra, and saw a lot of our neighbors were having a lot of water problems. And so that was like, okay, well, how are we doing here? And we started asking questions, realized we didn't have any data at all. And that's, I think, one of the things, the findings from the team is, you know, we have deficiencies in our knowledge. So that was the first part of this whole project, was like, well, let's get a baseline understanding of what's going on below the surface. So that's, welcome, there's chairs, feel free to sit down anywhere. Yep, one right over there. So yeah, I just want to ask before I introduce our consultant team, I just wanted to ask Mark to say a few words as our co-collaborator on this work.
Hi, everybody. Everybody online and folks that are watching this later to the fact. We are recording it so that other people can watch this as well. It's great to have such a full room. I want to start by recognizing that we're on the traditional unceded territory of the Malco, Tla'amin, and the Cortes First Nations. And this work is being done in collaboration with who's being on the advisory committee. And I think we're all here because we care about this island. We care about the sustainability of this island, and we know that the more knowledge that we have, the better decisions that we can make. So thank you for coming, and I appreciate you taking the time and insisting that this work is important. I heard from so many folks that water is a real big issue on the island, and that was identified in the housing forum that we put on together. I represent Cortes at the regional district, so the findings of this report, I'll be passing on to the district, and hoping that GWS will come in and present it as well. The timing of this is really great because we're currently going through a zoning bylaw review process and looking at land use on Cortes, and I think this is an important part of that. If we don't know what's going on, then how can we make a decision? So really grateful for the team of people that have made this happen, especially GWS Solutions for visiting the last couple of days. And I'm really excited to see the results here, and also hear from folks in the room, you know, what the questions are and concerns, and how we should be using this data. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mark. Great. So I do want to acknowledge the BC Real Estate Foundation. They gave us a grant to fund this work. And so couldn't have done it without them. So I want to acknowledge their contributions. I just want to say, having talked to the team earlier, this is really step one. Like, we should be monitoring wells. There's a bunch of other work. If as a community, we want to get on top of this. So I kind of really see this as just a gateway that we're collectively as a community going to have to go through if we really want to take this issue seriously. So there's lots of work ahead, I think. But I do want to just acknowledge Mark and you know, for helping to get it off the ground. And many of you have given them tours and are advising. There are maps, 2 maps over there on the wall. And there's some stickies, so afterward, or please put a sticky up if there's something that they should be aware of, area of concerns, somewhere you've seen a change, something like that. So our presentation today is going to be about an hour, I think. We've got a lot of content. They're not done with their project, so they're like 8/10 of the way or something like that. So this is a chance for them to share what they've found and to hear from you if there's things that are off or that they're missing, or data that you know about that they should be looking into, that kind of thing. So today's really a touch point, and they'll leave here today, they'll finish the project, and then they'll have a complete report, which we'll share online. And hopefully we'll get it at the SRD meeting. We'll share it with Chief and Counsel at Palouse. We'll just start to kind of share their recommendations and the information coming out of this work. Here's a chair if you'd like. And you can take that chair over there if you'd like. So that's basically kind of the flow. We're hoping that we would hold questions, we would let them present, and then when they're done, we can have questions. So the bulk of the information will be shared with you, and then we'll have discussion and questions, and if you need to leave, you can leave. But we basically block this time for a couple of hours. We can share the room if we need it, and the maps and stuff will be there for a longer period of time. Okay, so that's kind of the game plan for the day, and now I want to introduce. Okay, we need overflow chairs. This is exciting. I thought we're gonna have an empty room here, so. Welcome. We're full of some more chairs. Okay, so I want to introduce the GWS team. Sylvia's our project lead, and Groundwater Solutions are our leading firm that do this kind of work for other islands, and so that's kind of how we came across them. They did similar kind of work for, I think it was Salt Spring was one of the islands that kind of got us inspired to head down this path. So Sylvia will be is one of the leads, and Antonio is here as well, and Ali's here. And they're all hydrologists, groundwater hydrologists. So I haven't understood half of what they've said in the times we've talked, but they promised to make today's presentation kind of for lay people, so we can all understand it, hopefully. So I'll hand it over to you.
Solutions, and if I speak at this level, okay.
I feel like my back is good.
Yeah, what if you took the spot that Sandy had with that, or you could just see your screen?
Well, I didn't wanna be looking back, that's the one thing, I wanted to be kind of looking forward, but. You can turn the screen around.
I can turn mine around if you'd like.
Oh, yeah, that might work. You can advance the slides, sorry, perfect. And maybe we can make the participants look small. Away so that I can. That's great, I don't like having to.
Am I in the way?
No, not at all, that's perfect. So, yeah, essentially, Sadu and Mark have given the context of this work. We were brought on to begin the process of pulling together a model of the island, to a conceptual model and a geospatial model. So what I wanted to talk about today was to set the context of the water cycle and water sources on the island. Talk about the project and what we were aiming to do. Look at some of the results from our conceptualization or trying to understand the groundwater system here on the island, or the water system here on the island. Talk about some of the hazards and the risks that we think that could affect aquifers such as the Cortes aquifers, and including climate change and saltwater intrusion. Talk about some of the data gaps and what we might do to improve our understanding, and then open it up for discussion at the end of the talk. So most people are aware of the water cycle, but it might be, sometimes it's helpful to have start with some definitions so that we're all on the same page. So essentially the water cycle is the cycling of water from various reservoirs in the earth. So the atmosphere, the oceans, lakes, and so that movement between those water sources is driven by solar energy. When we're talking about an aquifer is essentially a geologic unit that's capable of storing and yielding water, a usable quantity of water, to a well or to a spring. So here on Cortes, we have a couple different kinds of aquifers. We have what we might refer to as overburden aquifers or unconsolidated aquifers, which are made up of grains of sand and gravel in which the water is held within the pore spaces of those sediments. We also have fractured bedrock aquifers. So this is rock that is fractured and faulted, and water is held within those faults and fractures. When we're talking about groundwater recharge, so recharge is essentially precipitation that has landed on the ground surface, has infiltrated to the point of where the subsurface, where the water table is. So the pore spaces or those fractures are saturated and full of water. So that recharge can occur as sort of diffuse infiltration over the land surface. And it also can be focused recharge. So depressions, faults, gullies, micro variations in topography allow that groundwater or that surface water to infiltrate and penetrate into the subsurface and make its way down to the aquifer. Come on, and I think there's one more, Chair.
No, let's save.
Oh, let's see. Okay.
Okay,
I got it back out.
this, okay.
Yeah, so, of course, water comes into the water system through precipitation and snowfall and snow melt, but it also goes out. So it goes out in the form of evaporation from lakes and surface water features and the soil, as well as transpiration through plants. And so we call those things together evapotranspiration. So that's the loss up into the atmosphere. And then groundwater discharge. So we have ground infiltration, recharge, and groundwater moving from high elevation to low elevation, and where
the groundwater is starting to come, shallow into the shallow subsurface, moving back up through the system. We call that a discharge zone. So in the recharge zone, the groundwater table tends to be deeper, but in a discharge zone, the groundwater table tends to be shallower. And then we can often see things like springs occurring where in discharge zones. So we had a couple different phases that we've undertaken to do this study. So the first one was just to bring together, you feel like you need to move over there. Okay. The first was to bring together as much as possible the information that was known about this island. So there have been previous hydrogeologic studies, there's mapping, there's public information layers about water licenses and wells, and we brought all that together. High resolution topography and that sort of thing. And then we used all of that to create what we call a hydrogeologic model. So that model is essentially our idea of what is happening on the island, and we've developed it as a three-dimensional computer model, essentially, that using information from the wells that have been constructed on the island, we can piece together what is happening in terms of layers in the subsurface, the depth of the water table, the depth of the bedrock surfaces beneath the sand and gravel deposits and that sort of thing. So putting that together enables us to then interpret what is happening in the local system. The next step was to try to understand the quantity of water that is available. We developed what we call a gridded water balance model. So again, looking at the landscape, considering breaking that up into units and considering the inputs and outputs of water from those units. We also have developed and we've created a water balance model that looks at the potential impacts of climate change. And then we've also looked at an assessment of the aquifer health. So looking at the water, trying to understand where water is being used and how much water surplus is available for water availability, and then how much is being used relative to the availability. So we can get an idea of the aquifer stress. And then we're looking at potential hazards or risks to water sustainability or security on the island. And then, of course, we're putting that together into the report that will be provided to the Housing Society and shared with the community to develop ideas for what can be done further. So there are multiple different water sources here on the island. Of course, some major water sources are the multiple lakes, in particular lakes that are located close to several areas. Cortes is lucky that it has, in comparison to some of the other Gulf Islands, that it does have these larger lake systems and storage that is contained within them. Of course, surface water is vulnerable to changes in land use that affect drainage patterns and eutrophication and things like that can affect water quality. So we are aware that those types of vulnerabilities exist with surface water sources. In terms of bedrock, or in terms of groundwater sources, there are several mapped aquifers on the island, and then there's other areas where wells are shown, but they're not mapped as aquifers. But anywhere where a well has been developed, you might be able to put it together once you have a cluster of wells to put it together to identify where an aquifer exists. Most of the island the groundwater sources originate from fractured bedrock aquifers, but here in Medicine Landing, down on the tip of the island, we have this unconsolidated aquifer. In terms of the productivity or the numbers of wells, these represent wells that are registered in the British Columbia groundwater wells and aquifers database. And so we have 110 wells that were, that are listed as having been drilled into the bedrock aquifer, and 113 registered wells that are listed as having been constructed into the consolidated aquifer. And then when well drillers drill their well, they estimate how much water the well can produce, and you can see that the average estimated yield for the unconsolidated wells tends to be somewhat higher than in the bedrock system. So this, I'm gonna talk a little bit about what these water sources look like for construction and their characteristics. So beginning with the springs and dug wells. In looking at the mapping for this area, and then anecdotally, we understand that the either historically and even at present, shallow groundwater source through dug wells or springs has been an important part of the water supply. There's a number of springs that are mapped, having been licensed through the provincial licensing system. And we see those and we're interested in those because they indicate where those groundwater discharge zones might be, where the spring pops up or where there's perennial wetness that is present. That could be an indicator of a groundwater discharge zone, or also perched water tables. What they look like could be a shallow pond, or a well such as shown here, where it's a large diameter cement rings or cribbing, and then the water tables, fairly shallow. These tend to be, less than 15 feet, 20 feet deep, and they are vulnerable to contamination, and depending on local factors may be seasonally limited in terms of how much water they can produce. So why do springs occur? I think that's something that many people might be interested in. There's different factors that can contribute to the presence of spring. One might be where the water table intercepts the topographically driven water table, and where the water table intercepts the land surface, and you see a seep or a breakout. You can also have contact springs. So if you have say a point of infiltration of water, and then there's unconsolidated materials or loose materials overlying materials with lower permeability along that contact point between those materials, either be the water may concentrate and flow on that surface. You can have one where springs that are driven by fractures and faults, so water returning to the surface along a fault plane. And then you can have perched, or this example where there's a till deposit and we have more permeable materials, and so as the water infiltrates, it hits that hard pan or low permeability material. It can't go anywhere, so it has to go along that surface and break out the next point of lower elevation. So we would expect that there is a case where your winter water table springs may be more prevalent, and that in the summer, as the water table deepens, then the springs may dry up or diminish in flow. The next type of wells, and we talked about the Manson's Landing or the Manson's area, unconsolidated sand and gravel aquifer. So in this type area, we might have drilled wells that have been constructed into the sand and gravel aquifer. So the well is like a column or a cylinder that goes down to the water bearing zone. There will be a screen at the bottom that allows the water to come into the well, and then you have your pump, and you pump that water out. This map shows where we've mapped the thickness of the overburden materials. So you can see that the sand and gravel deposits are thickest within the area that we are now. And then we also, there is a potential aquifer located in the Squirrel Cove area that has not yet been mapped, but there are some wells present there that are drilled and have consolidated deposits as well. And then you can see throughout the rest of the island, the presence of that sand and gravel layers tends to be thinner or absent. This one, so the third type of wells that we might see are drilled wells in fractured rock. Those, which I said that the well is drilled down to the point where the fractures are filled with water. They tend to be open holes, so there's casing down to in the upper part of the soil. But then beyond that, there's just the open hole, and water comes into fractures that are intercepted by the well and flows into the well bore. You have your pump that pumps the water up. And then here on the island, what we see is this granitic type of rock. So it's blocky with large vertical or lateral fractures. And so when you're getting water infiltrating into those faults and fracture zones, that's how it gets into the aquifer. And when you drill down into the rock unit, the productivity of the well depends on how many fractures it intercepts and how connected those fractures are to one another. So you might see higher yields in areas where there's a fault zone or fault system, and very low yields in higher elevation areas, or areas where the rock is more compact. So we know that these types of aquifers are seasonally replenished. So you see a variation in the groundwater levels going up and down according to the season. So in the winter, the groundwater levels will be high, and in the summer, they tend to diminish or go down low. And as hydrogeologists, we often want to look at what we call a hydrograph. So that's essentially a plot of groundwater level variation over time. And we can see these seasonal patterns of rising and falling of the water table. We can also see patterns related to well pumping in some cases, or tidal effects. So some aquifers are influenced by tides, and you can see daily variations in water level, and as a result of those tidal pressures within the aquifer. So the province of BC maintains a network of observation wells across the province. There's approximately 250, I think, observation wells spread over BC. And here in the West Coast region, like Vancouver Island and the Gulf Islands, you probably have about 85 wells where they monitor groundwater levels continuously. These are purpose-built or dedicated wells. They're not pumping any water. They're just there for monitoring groundwater conditions. So Cortes doesn't have any of those wells for within the provincial monitoring network. But I want to show you some of the data from similar types of aquifers that we have here on Cortes. So the upper hydrograph is one of the long-time monitored wells within a fractured granitic aquifer on the Saanich Peninsula. And you can see how the groundwater levels are fluctuate by approximately, so you see here on the vertical scale, the groundwater levels fluctuate by about 5 liters on an annual basis, with the highest water levels occurring in the winter period and the lowest water levels occurring in the summer period. Similarly, there's a sand and gravel, similar to the sand and gravel aquifer that we have here in Cortes. There's monitoring that in the Sand aquifer on Savory Island, and you can see that the groundwater levels also show both seasonal patterns as well as long-term patterns often related to climate cycles. So even different cycles of wet and drier periods. So one important point is to show that it's investing in monitoring. The longer you've monitored, the more insightful the data can be, because you can see long-term trends and variations. And so, it really shows the longer you study the conditions, the more you can kind of, ascertain what's happening within the system. So, all of that data is available online, and it gives us an idea, even if it's monitoring nearby, it gives us an idea of some of the effects of climate change or water use on the aquifers. And of course, we can do that kind of monitoring within community monitoring networks, and I can talk about that at the end a little bit. So, one of the, so these two maps show some of the maps that we will include within our technical report. The map on the left shows the depth to groundwater that has been mapped based on information within reported in the registered wells, as well as inferences based on topography. So you can see that in higher elevation upland areas that the groundwater table is deeper, and then in lower elevation areas, the groundwater table is shallower. And areas that are shown in blue are areas where the groundwater table is probably, you know, in the range of less than 5 meters below ground. And those are where we see some of these wetland systems where we have very shallow groundwater table, and in places where people have constructed some of their springs and dugouts that have been historical water sources. These little arrows also represent the direction of flow. So you can see that the flow is downslope and outward from different flow areas. So when we're trying to look at local conditions or thinking about the water availability and water balance questions, we want to have sort of a more realistic unit that where within which, so if we were looking within an area, that the conditions were more likely to relate to one another. So if you were, example, up at the northwest end of the island, what's happening in the groundwater may be very different or unrelated to what's happening with pumping of wells down here in Manson's Landing. So in order to sort of break down a more realistic unit for our analysis, we've broken up the island into management areas, and those are essentially like watersheds where we can look at the flow system essentially and use that as a unit for our analysis. So we've developed 14 water systems, and so going back there. So we wanted to talk about two of these management areas where we've looked at more detail and where we have more information based on from the wells and the modeling. So starting here in the Manson's Landing area, we've already talked about the main source. So this is kind of shows a map of the depth to, or the depth to groundwater. So it being deeper within the upper zone and shallower within the margins of this peninsula, Manson's Peninsula, you might call it. You can see those little blue arrows representing the directions of inferred directions of groundwater flow. And then these yellow dots represent wells that are constructed in the sand and gravel aquifer, and the pink dots represent wells that are constructed in the bedrock aquifer. We also can see the lakes up above, and one observation that is made is that the lakes are likely hydraulically connected to the sand and gravel aquifer, in that the lakes are a source of potential recharge or that flow that feeds into that Manson's aquifer system. So this is kind of showing if we were to do a slice into the earth and look at what's happening down below the surface. So if you show the map on the upper right-hand corner of the island, that black line represents where we've kind of sliced through the subsurface to look at what's happening and be able to conceptualize what our flow, what is happening. So you can see that at these higher elevation peaks and ridges that we imagine, or that groundwater or infiltration and precipitation is contributing recharge. And then they will have both local flow systems, so where the groundwater flows to the next kind of topographic low, and then you can have deeper regional flow systems that would, where the groundwater is kind of infiltrating into the aquifers and flowing out toward the coast. And then, and you can see that Hague Lake and Gunther Lake are kind of within, there's kind of a fault that passes along that valley bottom, between the Heber Creek or Seaford and, the Hague and Gunther Lake, valleys. And then here we have the Manson's, Landing Aquifer here, after 841 on the left-hand side. And again, this is kind of showing how conceptually it appears that the lakes will contribute to the groundwater system. The lakes with the water level within the lake is probably higher than perched above the level in the aquifer, the unconsolidated aquifer. And so you'll have the recharge over the land surface as well as coming laterally into the aquifer. And then you have the bedrock system underneath the unconsolidated system. I think that's probably good for that. So this is showing the aquifer 841 going crossways the other way. So again, you can see where the wells are located. Those wells appear as cylinders, and with the number, that's the well tag number, that database number within the groundwater wells and aquifers database. And you can have, there's appears to be a groundwater divide in the center of the peninsula. So infiltration and then movement outward toward the coast on either side of the aquifer and discharge at the foreshore. We've also made note of where the sea level is. So that's an important consideration when we're thinking about island settings, where sea level is an important kind of point of reference, because we'll have fresh water occurring as a lens of of low density water, and underneath that you'll see a mixing or transition zone where the water is a mix of salt and fresh water, and then below that saline water, and the saline water kind of intrudes or comes in as a wedge at the coastal margins. So the sea level is an important kind of reference point for us to kind of think about not wanting to pump too far below sea level, because then we can run into problems like seawater intrusion, which we can talk about. The other thing that's interesting is when you see this, the yellow represents kind of sand and silt layers. The blue line represents the water table, below which, and you can see the wells are constructed down into that saturated zone. And you can see that some of the wells have varying depths. The little black marks indicate where the screening is set. And then on the land surface or above the topmost, above the more permeable sediments, we see that gray material, and that represents materials that are interpreted as, like, say, that hard pan till, more dense, finer materials, and we would call that a confining layer. So it provides a measure of protection of the aquifer beneath it from contaminants that could infiltrate from the land surface, but it also slows the movement of groundwater down into the subsurface. Okay, so this is showing that same system coming down sort of across, down the middle of the peninsula from the higher elevation down to the end of Soutill Point. And you can see that closer to the sort of the middle part of the aquifer, there's a higher concentration or number of wells. And it also kind of shows those flow systems where we have the topographically driven flow from higher elevation ridges and mountains and flowing down into that unconsolidated system. All right, so moving on to the west part of the island, the Whale Town part of the island, we have a somewhat different kind of situation. Again, we have groundwater flowing groundwater flowing from high elevation or low elevation. We have the deeper groundwater table at the higher elevation ridges and a shallower water table as we go down topographically and toward the coast. Overlying the aquifer, we do notice that there is the presence of these till or materials, but as you go up into the mountain system, that layer of till may be thinner. And the aquifer, fractured rock aquifer may be therefore more vulnerable to contaminants introduced at the land surface. We also see that the presence of these topographically driven springs. So at the toe of the slopes or at changes in the slope, we can see springs, and you can see where along here the Whale Town Commons area where there's likely very wet conditions year round, and those are where we see those springs occurring. So this is a little bit more boring in terms of, it's just like, the idea if we were to cut it across that mountains or that Whale Town peninsula, you would see these fractured rock, some areas where there are overburden deposits and that can be utilized as water sources, but in general, most of the wells going down into the bedrock system. And I think that's all I want to say about that. All right, so getting on to kind of so we've conceptualized the aquifer, getting an idea of what's happening. So the next part is we wanting to try to understand the water balance. So we don't have to get too much into the details, but when we're thinking back to the water cycle, we've developed a water balance model. So we're looking at the factors like temperature, precipitation, the topography, and the soil moisture capacity. And that gets put into a model. And then what we get out is estimates of the potential and actual evapotranspiration rates. And we determine if there is any water left over. So water that is in the system used by plants, some of it's going to go out, and then some will be left over and be able to infiltrate into the ground surface. We look at this parameter called groundwater recharge potential. So that looks at the land surface and how likely it is that water is going to infiltrate at that location. From that, we determine the amount of recharge that is occurring, and then we look at the water use or water demand, and then we end up with an idea of how much water is available and how much is being used of the recharge that is occurring. So we're going to unpack a few of these pieces of the puzzle, as it were. The groundwater recharge potential. So whether or not groundwater is able to infiltrate, precipitation happens, whether it's going to infiltrate depends on a lot of things. So one is the slope of the land surface. So if we have a very steep slope, the water is probably more likely to run off before it's had a chance to infiltrate into the ground surface. Also land cover, if there's a vegetation or low permeability surfaces like paving or rock, it may be less likely to infiltrate there compared to permeable deposits or thicker loam soil layers. We also can, based on our estimated depth of groundwater below ground, we can kind of characterize a location based as being either a recharge zone or a discharge zone. So if groundwater is very shallow, then it's less likely to be infiltrating at that point. It's probably discharging at that point compared to where the groundwater table is deeper and it's more likely to be recharged. So all of that kind of is brought into what we call a model to determine this groundwater recharge potential, which is based on basically grids along the land surface. So this just shows some of the geologic, the data layers that we've used, the bedrock geology, superficial geology, and the aquifer mapping that has been done by the province, showing where the aquifers are occurring. And then these are some of the other input layers that we've used to do this gridded groundwater balance or the groundwater recharge potential model. So we look at land cover, for example, depth of the ground, groundwater, the presence of these linear features may, what we call lineaments, can indicate the locations of faults and fractures that where water can infiltrate into the ground. And then we also have mapped the topographic slopes, so where there's steep slopes and where there's more shallow or horizontal slopes, and that also affects how the water is going to enter the surface. And then we also look at the distribution of precipitation. So at higher elevation, parts of the island, there tends to be slightly higher precipitation compared to areas of the island where the topographically lower. So it's not like the precipitation is the same across the whole island. So this is looking at sort of the water balance model, thinking about factors like temperature and where we are in the latitude. We use what's called a Thorne weight model, which estimates we have the climate data, precipitation that's entering into the area. We have an estimate of actual evapotranspiration, and then from that we determine whether or not there's going to be a surplus. So water coming into the system, rain, the amount used by evaporation and plant use, and then what's left over. So the key things, takeaways for this one is that we have a higher surplus in the winter months, but then we have the spring and summer months where most of the water that comes into the system, if there is any, is going to be used by plants. So we have no surplus in the summer months. So that's where we can run into things like, well, we're gonna have to utilize storage that's already in the system, and we're not getting any more. So it's like as if you had a bank account and you're getting paid in winter and you're not getting paid in summer. So you have to last through the year when you're including those months when you're not getting anything in. So this one is again looking at sort of our current condition and surplus. It's basically showing us the same thing. We have the summer months in which there's very little surplus available, and the winter months when there's less utilization by plants and evaporation, and more of the water is coming into the system. This just shows some of the graphs, and of course this is going to be available in the report, and we'll talk a little bit more about the results, but these are results of modeling and how we expect, based on global circulation models, what we may expect in future in terms of the changes that will occur as a result of climate change. So what we might for example, the surplus that is likely to be diminished, so we'll have a lower surplus available in April. So essentially, we're going to have a much longer dry season in comparison to what we've had historically. So, in terms of, I talked about one of the key pieces that we're trying to understand is where water is being used. So what is the water demand, from the source? So, well, how we understand that, we have to kind of piece together data from different places. So one indication is where people have water licenses. So they may have obtained a water license from the province, and that license indicates when they're using it and how much. We can also look at where wells have been drilled and registered. But as we know, a lot of the time, or, sometimes wells have been drilled and there's no record of them, or no one has submitted a record to the province. And so we also have to look at things like land use. So where are people living, and what properties are vacant or non-vacant? And if there is no other source, so there's no surface water source on that property, and they're not within a service area for a water system, the likelihood is they're using groundwater. So that's kind of how we piece together on a lot by lot basis who's using the water. We also look at, where parks and protected areas, where they're likely not using the water. So, in the forest lands in the north, for example. And then we want to piece together a detailed water balance, and we're focusing on areas where we have more information and where there is more water use. So we're not going to, for the kind of conceptual model and the climate analysis stuff, we look at the whole island, but we really try to understand water availability within the priority areas of Manson's Landing and Whale Town. For now, because that's where we know water is in use and we have more information. So this kind of, what I had just explained previous was kind of our chain of thought of how we determine where is water being used and how much. So we look at where water is not being used, vacant land that is parks, protected areas, there's no activity going on that would need water. Are they on a water system? So there's small water systems that provide water to multiple parcels or that sort of thing. So we look for those, we'll say maybe they're getting water from a shared source. And then we look for information from that shared source as far as the usage per lot. Outside of service areas, then we kind of piece it together. So we look for whether they have a surface water license, do they have a well on the parcel, which aquifer is that well constructed in? If there's no well in the parcel, but there's no other water source, then we infer that there's a well there, and we say, well, it's probably from that principal aquifer that is found. Of course, this is prone to errors, but we're making generalized assumptions. And then in terms of water quantity, what they're using, we look at what the land use is. So are they just a residence, or are they a large acreage and it's like cleared land and a big garden, or they're an industrial operator, or they're a little commercial shop, so they probably only have like a little bathroom that no one uses, and so you're making inferences about the quantities of use based on what is happening at that location. And so the other thing that we wanted to consider, so the big question everyone has is how is the change in land use or potential, ideas that people have about changes in land use, how might that affect the water availability on the island? So we're considering various scenarios. So one scenario would be, so if we have some lots that are currently vacant, what if we were to develop those? So, based on, non-vacant land, but they're gonna be developed for domestic water supply. You could look at that as a scenario, or we can look at scenarios like increasing density, so 2 lots or 2 houses per lot, or, other types of things. So, some of the things that have been proposed, like things like secondary suites or multiple homes per parcel. So we can look at those and see how does that affect the water balance. Another one that we probably don't have enough information to examine fully, but I think is important to consider, because I know that there's a lot of desire to be more self-sufficient as an island and grow food and things like that. And, you know, there's some tremendous lands that could be really useful for that. One could look at how that changes in the type of crop or the amount of irrigation, and also in the long term, how climate change might affect irrigation demand, because agriculture and irrigation are one of the major users of water provincially in the agricultural areas. We know that is true. So when, you know, thinking about the potential sources of air, we're looking at this on an island like this, a really key factor is we've got a full-time population, but then the population swells in summer. We've got visitors, we've got temporary residents. And so that has an effect that is sometimes hard to tease out when we're thinking about the water balance. So are visitors less likely to conserve? Or, you know, how many people are actually here? We don't have an idea about the seasonal fluctuation in groundwater conditions on the island. So that's where the monitoring and everything comes in. We don't have any observation wells on the island. We don't have a very good idea about that. We can make inferences again from other regions, but that's something that would definitely benefit in the future. Similarly, we don't have either climate or surface water monitoring on the island. There were some historic stations that might measure stream flows, and but in terms of Water Survey of Canada stations, there's no active ones. And there were some historical climate stations that measured by, monitored by Environment Canada, but those have closed down. So we're using data often from further away in the Campbell River stuff.
We're about 50 minutes in, just as a time check.
Yes, I know, yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, these maps just kind of show locations where there are water licenses. So most of the information that we have, there's only a couple actual groundwater licenses, but we have shown in blue, these triangles, mostly surface water licenses that are on the island, and then these red triangles indicate licensed springs. And then on the right-hand side, we have a map of where we've identified potential non-domestic groundwater use. So under the Water Sustainability Act, the water license is required for diversion of groundwater for non-domestic purposes. So agriculture, commercial, industrial use, groundwater license, which would be required. And so there's a number of those folks on the island, some of whom I understand have applied for the license and maybe in the process of getting their license. So getting into some of the hazards and risks. So of course, when we're looking at a groundwater system, we can have naturally present minerals such as iron and manganese that can affect the potability of water and its pleasantness for drinking. So iron, for example, you know, can cause a red fleck or red color to the water, and it may affect the taste of the water. Manganese, or often present as like a black fleck in the water. It can stain your laundry and fixtures, and it can, at higher concentrations, can be associated with health conditions. You can have contaminants that are present at the land surface that can affect the groundwater quality. So I know our sewage is in these type of communities is disposed via septic systems, and so that can contribute to presence of nitrates, for example, in groundwater. In agricultural areas, manure and that sort of thing can also be sources of both pathogens or nutrients that affect water quality. And then another hazard that we recognize within one of these island settings is the seawater intrusion. So seawater intrusion or saline intrusion can be indicated as an increase in the salinity of the groundwater in comparison to what it would have been naturally. So, and it may indicate where water use is unsustainable. So more water is being drawn in than is available, so it's starting to flow or change the condition, local conditions. So I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. The water quantity related hazards include potentially, and I'm not saying that there's an evidence of that or observations of that currently, but there is a potential if demand exceeds supply, you could run into depletion of the aquifer. So that could be manifest as deepening of groundwater level or seasonal deficits. So wells running dry seasonally and being replenished in winter, but limits and use in summer. We are expecting and already observing changes in relation to climate change and this longer dry seasons that are happening. So with higher temperatures, you get higher evapotranspiration. We're also seeing a longer period over which we have limited rainfall. And we're seeing a change in the timing and intensity of water and that precipitation that's going to affect groundwater recharge. Seawater intrusion, again, from a quantity perspective, can be observed as a deepening of groundwater levels in coastal areas and pumping below ground surface. So looking at some of the climate things, so people want to say, is it drier? Is it wetter? So we're using data from the Campbell River Airport, which is, obviously southwest of the island. We can see that this is a long-term climate record from that, or long-term precipitation record from that station. And we can see that from 1965 to present, or 2024, I think we'll continue to. And then the numbers indicate the number of days that there were data points for those years. So some years we have a little bit less data. But we can see that historically we could have had maybe up to about 2 meters of precipitation on an annual basis. And there's a somewhat general trend of decreasing precipitation, but obviously there's inter-annual variation, dry years and wet years. Looking at monthly trends for that same period, so 1960s to present, we see that these black lines will indicate the trend in the precipitation for each month. And we can see that for only a couple of months, we can see an increasing trend. So in January, we've had potentially increasing trends. So that indicates that we might be having slightly wetter Januaries. But on the whole, most of the months are showing either stable or a declining trend. So we're seeing less rainfall in February and March, less rainfall in July and August. And that's certainly what anecdotally we're kind of observing as well. This again kind of showing the breakdown between winter and summer precipitation, and you can see definitely that those were getting kind of drier summers, and then probably summer conditions depending on how much water we received during that winter period. So what's seawater intrusion? I think it's really important when we live on an island and we're utilizing water on an island that we really understand what's happening. So I've already talked about how in an island setting, all of the water that is present within the local aquifer comes from precipitation on the land surface or along the higher elevation and flowing down into the lower elevation. So there's sometimes people have an idea that it's coming from the Olympic Mountains, or it's coming from, in Victoria, people would always say, well, it's coming from Mount Baker, but really we're surrounded by saline water, and all the water that is here comes from precipitation that lands here. So we have this freshwater lens that's sitting above the saline zone. As I mentioned, you can have, if you have an intrusion, that can be where you have a mixing between the fresh water and the saline water. And it can occur due to you move that one. It can be as a process, as a result of active processes like, pumping of wells. Or it also can result where, you have mature groundwater, so you're drilling down into zones of saline or mature groundwater or water that has been trapped in formation from periods of high sea level. In general, across BC and especially in coastal BC, most groundwater has a chloride level of 150 milligrams per liter chloride. And we use chloride as an indicator of whether intrusion is occurring. In seawater, we have the total dissolved solids is around 3,500 milligrams per liter, or chloride around 19, or 35,000 milligrams per liter, or chloride about 19,000 milligrams per liter. So it's very concentrated salt. So because it's so concentrated, it could take as little as about 2% mixing seawater, and you're gonna get with a freshwater source, you would have a saline taste. So, above, so that would indicate chloride above 250 milligrams per liter is around when it can start tasting the milk. And then if we mix in as little as 4% of seawater, that water can maybe unusable for all but some industrial processes. So it doesn't take very much of mixing in order to affect the water quality. So why are we worried about solid intrusion? Of course, once salinization of an aquifer occurred, it may take many years to recover, or if ever. When we're from an operational perspective, water that is higher in chloride and total dissolved solids is more corrosive, so it can corrode your plumbing, it can affect you might have to replace your water tank, hot water tank more frequently. It can potentially increase the cost of well maintenance. And then if you're chlorinating the water, that chlorine mixes with the chloride and fluoride in the seawater, and it can cause the formation of trihalmethanes, or which are carcinogenic. Also, the Water Sustainability Act does prohibit operation of a well in a manner that causes intrusion of saline water that affects the usability of water for other users in the aquifer. And then some people say, well, okay, we're on an island, maybe we should just desalinate. Well, as a scientist, I think let's preserve what we have. Let's try to carefully manage it, because if we go down the path of having to desalinate, not only is it very costly and energy intensive, but you're left with a high concentrated brine solution, and so that also has to be disposed of. So it's an engineering solution that is really important in certain areas like Australia. It's really widely used. Even in Southern California, they use desalinization or desalinized water as a water source. But I think we're not there yet. Let's preserve what we have and make sure that it's safe. So this kind of showing it schematically. So talked about the freshwater lens, talked about the transition zone of mixed salt and fresh water, and then below which that saltwater wedge that comes inland. We have recharge coming in and discharge, and that groundwater discharge toward the coast is what holds that salt water at bay. That transition zone between the fresh and the salt water is going to vary seasonally and according to tidal flux and that sort of thing. So where that point is below the ground surface will fluctuate. And then on the right hand side, we talk about some of the things that might occur that could affect or cause a saltwater intrusion. So first off, in terms of climate change, we're expecting sea level to rise. So just that in alone will affect that dynamic that's happening at the coast. We also expect that there could be an increase in things like storm events, storm surges, where saline water can overtop those coastal aquifers. And then there's things like the human effect. So one thing is the drilling of deeper wells within coastal aquifers. So if you get down too deep, you may intersect that zone of saline water. And then that well becomes a conduit for mixing of water from the saline up into the freshwater zone. Another is the effect of pumping. So if one were to overpump a single well, or if there is an area of high well density, multiple wells pumping, that interface can move inland and upward. And then also dynamics that affect groundwater recharge. So if there's a reduction in groundwater recharge, again, there's less of that groundwater flux that is holding that saline water at bay, and so you have movement in that transition zone. So just on the water quality side, what do we think has intruded? Well, our flags would be chloride of 150 milligrams per liter. Above that concentration where there could be a potential of a problem occurring. Chloride of 250 milligrams per liter is a drinking water limit. So I talked about that being kind of when we can start to taste the saline water. And then thinking about irrigation. Some plants can be more or less sensitive to salinity. And so the British Columbia guidelines typically indicate a chloride level of 100 milligrams per liter or less is ideal for irrigation and water to reduce effects of salinization of your soil, for example. So yeah, move on. So there is some provincial mapping that has been done, which shows the hazard of saltwater intrusion based on just on the aquifer characteristics. And we see that the areas that are at highest risk of saline intrusion are areas with limited recharge, where there peninsulas, where the thin peninsulas, where the sea is bordering the land, areas of high well density and low elevation, where the groundwater table is close to or close to sea level, or the pumping water level is close to or below sea level. So here on Cortes, for example, the peninsula Sutil Point, you see that there's these lots that come along the coast, that area is somewhat higher risk of seawater intrusion. Similarly, around Cortes Bay, we talked about Granite Point there, that because it's that classic thin peninsula with limited recharge, so and the fractured rock setting, it could be at higher risk of intrusion. So getting into some of the next steps and recommendations, or I'm talking about the data gap. So definitely we're at the early stages of kind of gathering that information. And so this, you can look at it as an opportunity. What data could we start sharing and gathering to be able to better understand and characterize what's happening? So on the water quality side, many water systems collect their data, but it's kind of held amongst their own self. Or maybe they're not monitoring very frequently, but they could be monitoring more frequently. Water quantity and use, well, that's another gap that we oftentimes people don't meter their use, they don't know how much they're using, and we could definitely improve our, definitely knowing how much we're using is the first step to get into conserve. Water quantity wise in terms of flow or levels in the aquifer. I mentioned about the hydrographs, so looking at those, being able to see those seasonal variations in water levels. So I think that definitely it would be nice to be able to understand what the conditions are that way. Climate can vary a lot spatially over a landscape, and so having some local climate monitoring could be valuable. And yeah, moving on. So there's some really interesting examples of island communities that have taken it onto themselves or to try to understand what's happening within their local area and establish community monitoring networks, either independently through nonprofits, groups, or with support with the regional government. So Regional District of Nanaimo, for example, has a volunteer observation well network where they fund and they have installed monitors within a network of observation of active wells that are used by well owners within the different communities, groundwater dependent communities. But closer to home, or we have the Quadro Island Climate Action Network, ICANN, has been taking the initiative to work with Vancouver Island University to do a similar geospatial modeling of the island. And then they've targeted certain wells with, distributed across the community and installed loggers, and they're collecting information, and with that information, they'll be able to better understand local conditions. So that is a really cool initiative that's close to home, and they probably have some lessons that could be brought to this community. Similarly, on Salt Spring Island, they have the Salt Spring Island Freshwater Catalog, which it has focused more on surface water sources and collection of data, but essentially, again, local stream keepers and volunteers collecting information, including seasonal observations, and then they've published that on the specific data stream, which is an open data source portal, and those observations can be used, and they're building that record and that understanding over time. So those are two examples that I think are pretty inspiring of what is possible. So, coming to the recommendations, what can we do? So we know that water is limited and we need to respect and conserve it. Canadians are high water users on a global sense. And certainly in island communities, some people who manage their own water source and water supplies are more conserving compared to city dwellers who can just turn on the tap and don't have any issues. So, but still, that conservation ethic is something that we have to come to terms with and continue to utilize in the future. Making sure that we check for leaks and deal with those quickly. Alternate water sources like rainwater catchment cisterns are in widespread use on some of the smaller and drier islands. And certainly those can be a really good source, especially for irrigation water. Or in an area like, say, you have highly mineralized groundwater, maybe the rainwater could be a good potable source, and there's some really great guides that are out there. There's Salt Spring Island produce their own, and the Regional District of Nanaimo as well, have a guidebook of how to set up your own rainwater collection system, including for potable use and the considerations that you would want for setting up that type of system. We can certainly do more on as water users to collect or record what's happening with our wells, and take it. Certainly if you're using a well water source, you may want to test the water and have a better understanding of what the water quality is and keep track of those records over time. And another recommendation would likely be around well owner education, so that we could, provide, or the more information could be shared on about well stewardship. If you have unused wells, having them properly decommissioned is really important, because those wells then are not going to be a conduit to contamination in the aquifer. If you end up getting saltwater intrusion in your well, think about what is the cause and consider using an alternate source or trying to investigate that further to try to protect that water source. In terms of education, I think that's really important that we understand kind of the preciousness of our water sources. So aquifer signage, this is the water supply area. But in this case, in the groundwater case, the water supply area is everywhere under our feet. So what we do at the land surface really is important. We talked about well smart workshops, septic smart workshops, making sure that our septics are running properly and maintained. Trying to improve a well inventory in areas where we don't know all the wells that are occurred. And then regional district as well, there's some models where there's funding or rebate programs to help private well owners be good stewards of their water supply, get testing, make well upgrades if needed. Those types of programs exist and I think are a real benefit in the communities where they can establish. The monitoring, I think it would be great if we could establish a community monitoring network. And then we can think about what land use policies and things will help contribute to, water protection and protection of the aquifer. So that is, so the next steps, we're gonna wrap up the results of the study. We'll be having that reviewed by Cortes Housing Society and shared amongst the project partners. And then there may be opportunity to, or there will be opportunity to share those results. And then I guess it's up to the community and where they want to go next, you know, in terms of further evaluating the issues of water. One study is not going to do it. It's a long-term commitment to try to understand what's going on and to contribute to our understanding and knowledge and protection of this precious resource. That's all.
So folks, we've been sitting for a long time. I know a few of you had said you had to leave early or now, so take a moment if you want to head out. But they're going to stay and answer questions if you have them. So won't be hurting anybody's feelings if you get up and head out. But those of you that want to stay, please feel free to ask questions. And I think the maps are here. Make notes on those if you want. But yeah, any questions for the team?
Yeah, do you want to have a price break or are we gonna go straight into?
Let's just power through. Do you want to call on people since you're going to be answering the questions?
Sure, and
Okay.
maybe we can have Antonio or, you know, it doesn't have to just be.
You need a break or you?
No,
okay?
it's good, it's good, yeah, let's
Well, first of all, do you think doing the housing society for kickstarting something that, you know, could be started 25 years ago, it might have changed how they so kudos to Mark and to you, and to all of you for starting us down the right creek, so to speak. Question about observation wells. You mentioned that the province does fund and does organize or set that up, so because they're expensive. So how would we move in that direction as an island community?
Yeah, well, I think that it might make sense to start with a community monitoring network. That probably would be more cost effective and an early start, so using existing wells and setting up some for monitoring. If there was a desire to have a provincial dedicated observation well, certainly the Housing Society and the Regional District could reach out to the province and indicate that there is there's a desire or priority for monitoring. And it depends, I'm not sure what capacity there is to expand the provincial observation well network, but I think starting to have those conversations, it's, you know, and reaching out government to government to say, you know, there's a need, this is a groundwater dependent community. The challenge being it is also farther, you know, it's 2 ferries away and, you know, and it is expensive. So I think that in the short term, trying to establish a community monitoring network would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I just jump in. We were talking about this earlier because in our earlier conversations, this came up a lot as well. I heard from Sylvia that there are devices you can buy and put in your well, or $600-ish kind of thing. And they can monitor temperature, they can monitor how much is being used, the levels. And it feels like step one is we find 5 or 10 or 15 of us and just start doing that so that we can at least we get a baseline, you know, and we could do, I think through Rainbow Ridge, we would do it there, but if, you know, we could probably get a grant and then we could get people to apply, we could put a little strategy together, different parts of the island, and we could subsidize these devices, and I think that would, like, just as a start, to get a number of them on the island, we start to get baseline data, which it feels like would be really helpful for us kind of moving forward. So that, I think, my sense is that would, I'm hearing from this report, that's one immediate takeaway that we just need to get going on it. It's not a lot of money, it doesn't sound like, and I think we could probably learn from what Quadra's done, because it sounds like they've got a really good monitoring network going. So I think that's, from what I've heard today, is kind of one immediate kind of low hanging fruit takeaway for us to start understanding. And I don't know how much we use, but in the city, you have a meter, you see how much water you use. Like here, I think you could have a leak in one of your pipes underground and not really even know it. And so I do think for us to be responsible stewards of our wells, we just all start understanding how much we're using.
Yeah, Antonio's shown, the provincial observation well that's located on Quadra Island. So that's, observation well 383. And that has been monitoring groundwater levels. This is showing the provincial system through the groundwater level interactive website. And if you click on the well itself, it can show the data. And so it comes, you can see the long-term record. And so when the well was established, there was a period of time over which the groundwater table was diminishing, and then it's kind of stabilized since then. There was some thoughts that maybe the well came in just slightly before some nearby higher water use. And so that's why the sort of initial period of record was showing this decline. And then you can see the sort of intramural variability. It's actually doesn't vary by much from winter to summer condition, about a meter or less of variability. But definitely that's a good data set to kind of look at and really useful tool. But I don't know.
Well, I was just gonna say that, if you wait for the government to do something, it's gonna take a long time, right? You probably will have to,
No, that's outrageous. Here, the government's on top of things.
So the other experience that with the RDN, for example, the RDN, is not district of Panama, you can see that they have already quite a few provincial observation wells. Not district of Panama, here all the way to Riola. But on top of this, they do have a community program as well. So they monitor, they have 37 observation wells on top of all of these. To try to understand their output, and they do have a report every year regarding the water levels and the output health. So
And the number of observation wells were established in RDN came as a result of partnerships between the province and Natural Resources Canada. So there was a number of studies that occurred over a number of years, and then some new wells were drilled, and the density of the monitoring network was expanded because of that interaction between government levels of government.
So we just got a question from someone online.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll read it. She said she wanted us to know that there are quite a few wells that are not registered, including hers. So they wouldn't be included in this current study. In particular, wells developed on island here, that one of the folks installing them wasn't registering them. So she's saying it might be a good idea to do a bit more digging into just how many unregistered wells there are. And can we find a record of that and collect them and, get the paperwork for those. So yeah, just unregistered wells. I mean, at the beginning, you kind of said there are 200 and some.
Mm-hmm.
We know there's like 600 more houses here. So likely, I don't know, that's 200 to 400 wells that maybe aren't being included in the study. So maybe if you could just talk about how that impacts the study and what we want to do to start collecting that data.
So you can, so it is true, know that there are large numbers of wells that haven't been registered. So well owners, if they have information about their well, they can register their own well. So if you go to the provincial observation, provincial well registration. Anyways, definitely, through the province, you could submit your own information. So if you know how deep it is, you know where on your property it is, you can submit it as a well owner. So that's kind of the easy first step, that if
Right.
people want to make sure, and I think it is a good idea to register your well. Some people prefer to have that information included, but it's helpful to know, okay, yeah, groundwater is being used in that area. Then also within our city, we're using other proxies. So we're not only using the registered wells, we're looking at where water is likely to be used because there's occupancy of the land or a house or something other, or a farm or something else. So we're using that to try to tease out where groundwater is being used by wells that haven't been registered.
Okay, thanks. Maybe we'll get that link from you and send it around to everybody. There's a sign-in sheet going around, so please sign in. And I'll get that link and send it to everybody.
Yeah, I've been there for a long time, 4 years, I guess. I'm looking at this bylaw that the Housing Society has put forward, which would over time significantly increase the density, and it's kind of across the board that we would be allowed more dwellings on practically every parcel on the island, depending on the size. And when I listen to this, I want to ask you the question, you feel there's an adequate amount of information about the availability of water to support that level of development?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we're still, we haven't come up with the final results of our study yet. And we may be able to answer that to, obviously with some error bars there. But I think the one thing that I've observed here locally is that the lots tend to be fairly large. And that is a benefit, so there's more distance between the wells and a larger land area from which that water supply is coming for each lot. So in that sense, I think that there is a potential for, to accept greater density,
But what you just said was because there's more space
Yeah,
around us,
yeah, so
which
the,
is not just a water issue, but it's a whole bunch of other issues. Because there's more space around us and because these wells are not all poking into the same place, you have that recharge capacity, I would assume, from all of this. And I really wonder whether we don't have this bylaw running out ahead of the information that we really need to be able to have that kind of density, and whether that should be slowed down. And I would address that question to our regional director.
Yeah, I think the zoning bylaw review process right now, the current draft has, I think, 427 more units. Most of those units are additional dwelling units within the primary house. So I think a lot of people have heard people are going to allow another unit. Most properties can have a house and a cabin right now. And for most of the increase in density, people are going to be allowed a house with an additional unit in it and a cabin that's going to be, we're suggesting, increasing in size. So as far as like having another separate house on the property, I think there might be a little bit of confusion perhaps that people think that these are going to be necessarily more houses, but most of the density is coming from people potentially being able to add a basement suite or turn their house into some kind of duplex. But I think it's a valid question. That's part of the reason why we're going down this road and starting this exploration.
And
then also
like to encourage a cautious approach to the density issue, because I think it has a lot of this is outside your realm, but it has a lot of other consequences.
well, but another observation is that indoor use of water. So when you're thinking about, say, a basement suite, indoor use of water and the proportion of our water use is actually the smallest portion of it. The outdoor use, irrigation, is probably a bigger component of our water use. And that shows in all of, city parcels where they have metered, each parcel, summer demand is much higher than winter demand. So if we're talking about adding one more bathroom or a kitchen, maybe that's not gonna be the big change in water demand.
Okay, so
I mean, you're using your water, you're trying to keep from depleting your water supply. But if you're running your water, washing your car, for instance, it's going into the ground, it's just being returned to the groundwater supply, is that correct?
Yeah, so sometimes in water balance studies, they do think about water return, so,
Yeah.
water return through septics, water return through irrigation. And that, you know, so they might estimate, say, a third of the water or a certain percentage of the water coming back into the system. And that is true sort of technically. One observation that I do make is that when you're irrigating or using outdoor, it's usually in the summer and when you have a moisture deficit in the soil. So I think that it probably, when you're talking about the aquifer being down several tens of meters, and that soil deficit, moisture deficit, most of that water in the shallow zone is gonna be evaporated or transpired by plants. And very little is actually gonna make it down to the deeper aquifer system.
Okay, so you're using it, you're losing it, just because of that.
Well, yeah, you would just consider it consumptive use, yeah.
Is that included from the septic field as well?
Well, I mean, this definitely septic systems are discharging into, you know, the subsurface above the aquifer, or depends on how deep your aquifer is. And septic returns do recharge the aquifer. And from a contamination point of view, we think about it, as an effect. But yeah, how much that's offsetting the water demand, I think it's safer if you're to just assume that the water use is consumptive and kind of like it's out of the, yeah.
I have a question around, it's kind of a VHOC question. So one of the concerns I'm hearing on the island is that one of the challenges people have, and certainly for young people who are trying to develop property when it's not a budget, you know, boring water from their neighbor's well, is often sometimes how people start and I'm wondering, it seems to me that like having 10 wells is worse than having 10 dwellings come from one well. Is that right? Am I getting that right? Is it better to have 10? Like, is there a difference in having 10 wells compared to having one well that feeds 10 places? Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a lot of value in having small water systems, like little pods, as it were, you know, shared sources. Not only is it more economic, people can share the costs of operations. People can share the responsibility of running the water supply and definitely, you know, when people are everyone on their own well, then it's like more hold in the aquifer, more, you know, potential for drilling down and, so I think that shared systems are an important component or should be promoted
Yeah.
more on the islands. But that being said, you know, having a good agreement between one another, you know, so, many times, like when I used to work for the province, I would get, you know, calls from people and say, well, I used to have a handshake deal with my neighborhood, you know, we were good friends and or our family, and then the land ownership changed and then the agreement, you know, went south or whatever. So having an easement, having a shared use agreement, something that's, or, you know, something that's in writing and solid, so that if the land ownership change or that you don't lose access to your water source, I think it is important.
The economic argument makes a lot of sense to me. I'm wondering, is there, as far as aquifer health and salinization, does it make sense on that side too?
Well, it depends on where's the well sited, so if you were over pumping a well close to the coast, then you could have the potential to pull in that salt water the same way as if you were pumping multiple wells on the coast, so you have to, it's both, like, I think that, you know, more straws drawing, it also has a potential to move that saline interface, but definitely higher demand on one source can significantly impact things, especially if you have, say, a leak
Yeah.
or something like that.
Because I'm trying to make the argument to VHA that look, just on the economic side, a housing crisis, we need to figure out ways to like share wells. That's a big deal. And I'm wondering if there, you know, as I advocate to the province, if there's an argument that this is actually a good thing for the aquifer health as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just, it has a potential to be better managed if it's a water system, but then it has to be the right mechanism. So, you know, there have to be water societies or to establish a utility is very costly. And there's no more improvement districts that are like policy-wise, provinces and supporting improvement districts. So a lot of the time, what happens in other regional districts or like for RDN, if an area is getting developed, the developer establishes a well of proof of potable water. And for that subdivision is approved and that water system gets passed on to the local government as a utility that's run by the local government. So if that's the model that's used in other areas as the local government taking control, that's also in Salt Spring, CRD running a lot of the small water systems that, and even some of the improvement districts transitioning over to CRD operation. So, because the improvement districts really struggle with, they don't have the funding mechanisms for getting, say, grants and stuff like that, or capital costs. And so, it's a responsibility to run a water system, so who's running it is important. And if it's volunteer run, it can work really, really well, but it's, there can be burnout, with different people moving on, et cetera, et cetera. So, thinking about those management aspects is important.
And the last question, as we're going through a zoning bylaw review process right now, and the fact that we don't have a building service on Cortes, so people don't have permits need to get a permit to put a place up. Are there creative or things that you can think of that would be useful to include in the zoning bylaw that would help us protect the aquifer, and just smart things that we can do? Or are there examples of things that we can do in a zoning bylaw to make sure people aren't drilling into the salinization zone? Or I don't know, open question if you have any ideas.
Yeah, I mean, that's the golden question. There's involved in similar projects in other island communities, thinking about what can be done. And, in terms of well drilling, there's no permit required to drill a well, and and the siting is generally considered to be under either the health hazards regulation with respect to siting away from contaminants, or under the Water Sustainability Act and groundwater protection regulation with respect to siting relative to other wells or whatever, which is provincial jurisdiction. Yeah. So I noticed that you guys have an OCP and your OCP that you're meant to site wells 100 meters distance from a coastline. That's one of that's already in the SRD bylaw.
Well, the OCP,
And,
I don't think it's in the bylaw, and I'm wondering if there's anything that we can put in the bylaw.
Well, that sounds like something.
There's something,
The distance
because I
from the
remember reading it,
coastline.
I have to find the reference, but it is, because I was surprised
interesting.
that it's already there. So, but I don't know how aware people are of that. Some jurisdictions, for example, but you don't have a building permit process, but in other jurisdictions where they have a building permit, they sometimes, or if a development permit, then they may require some testing, for example. In that case, I like this Cowichan Valley Regional District, for example, if you have to get a development permit, if you're in a development permit area, then you need to undertake certain well testing. But currently, I think they only require bacteria testing and not full drinking water package. And I think if you're in a coastal zone and you're at risk of saltwater intrusion, getting people to submit a chloride sample or like a proof of water quality would be helpful. But again, that's kind of getting into like meeting, building limits and things like that people are wanting to go down that path. So I think it's part of a larger conversation It's not, I think there's, how we build those planning mechanisms in, like a lot of the stuff that we do is voluntary and around education and awareness rather than forcing people to do it. So I think that having more awareness out there and helping people being better stewards of their water. And like, I think, you know, RDN does a tremendous job in terms of, we have a funded drinking water watershed protection program, ongoing money that they can put to research and monitoring, rural rebates, the education programs for well owners, all of those have shown tremendous benefit in the protection of the water source. And those are non-regulatory. They're not forcing people to do it. It's like bringing people along through education and awareness. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Got another question over there.
Yeah, that's right.
Are there examples of, communities that have screwed up their aquifer that have suffered and had to move or diminish the size of their community? Are you aware in BC of, I mean, we're talking about aquifer health here, and I don't know how many people have suffered the worst case scenarios. Does that happen? You know?
Well, I mean, I don't know about moving, but there've been have had communities that run into water shortages and like Sunshine Coast a few years ago, there was a, they almost ran out of water. Yeah, surface water source. And they're having to try to identify and develop other water sources to augment the supplies for the municipality. Tofino was another example where they ran into water shortage, so to the point where they were having to truck in water on an emergency basis in order to run the, and again, that was a surface water source that they didn't have enough storage and they didn't implement conservation measures early enough in the season, and then they realized kind of late in the game, oh, we're close to running out, and then, as I said, had to state of emergency, people canceling weddings and trucking water up over the hills and so, and definitely there's some areas that are probably using desalination for their water because there's no other source or the source has been impacted. As far as at the community level, I don't know, but certainly in regional district of Nanaimo, very groundwater dependent area. And the municipal or regional district run wells, some of them are starting to see impacts of saline water and having to develop other water sources in response to overuse. So they're not moving, but they're having to conserve Plan B type water sources and
You go around, drive around like Gabriola, every house has these massive cisterns. They're all catching rainwater and they're all using it because they have very little water.
yeah, Hornby is
A
really.
lot of the islands, I think, they're not leaving, but they really need to ramp up. That's why we need to figure this out before we get to that
So
place.
this area, Scott Point, it's called Scott Point, I was involved with this project in South Spring, and you can see this blue dots are the wells there. They have a desalination plant there.
Oh, this one is,
This one is the Scott Point, right?
yeah. So, yeah, they do use desalination for their water source. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to the need for building this database. I mean, the importance of this document, to inform decisions about development. So I guess I would really like to emphasize, I see value in using existing wells. I think that for the price of a one government drilled dedicated monitoring well, we could drop a data logger down 30 existing wells. Okay, so that's what we should try to do. And I think the other thing is, after attending a meeting of Quadra ICAL, the hydrologists there were emphatic that they felt they wouldn't even begin to have a sense of the picture they were developing for at least 5 years. So I think we should understand that it's critically important it's not gonna give us useful information quick, all right, so. Speaking to the caution that's already been mentioned, I know we need housing, but I think that we need to be careful that we don't, get ahead of ourselves here.
For instance, Quadra, I believe, my friends over there that have been, that the, Quadyaski Cove area was designated for intensive development early on because of its location, but in fact, it doesn't have the water. And, I think I've heard that from the regional director over there too, that they have a big concern of trying to have enough water for that area. And along with it, the other end of it is that they've had to create a community sewage system, which is becoming very expensive to maintain because they've got so much density in that area, so.
I think we had another question over here. I'm sorry to interrupt, but Max has.
I think Fran had a question.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask about like precedent or examples, if you know any, for water sharing, but also where are the, like, looking geographically at Cortes and finding where the best spots to draw water from are, and how that could help in like a bit of a water crisis, if there's like better spots than others to go into, or if there's already existing wells and like how much you can actually draw from that for how many people. That kind of research I'm really curious about. And then also just like alternative water solutions, like holding things in rainwater collection as more like temporary options, or like maybe like newer folks moving to the island, you don't want to drill a well or whatever. But yeah, I would be curious to know like if there is spots on Cortes that it's just better to draw water from than others because of the slope or how the water is replenished, or if it's not close to the ocean, that sort of thing.
Right, yeah, I mean, I guess probably, this area, the Manson's area is probably a fairly good aquifer, but it's very costly to transport, like to build infrastructure. So having water sources that are close to where it's being used, I think is the most cost effective, so like I talked about, in response to Mark's question, like neighborhood pods, like if you were to share a water source, like have it be neighborhood based or something like that, or like a subdivision type thing. Then in terms of alternative water sources, like the rainwater catchment is a really good option. And then there's numbers of people that run only on that. And so especially, I wouldn't say necessarily here on Cortes, but in other islands, it might be more that are drier, for example, or have poorer aquifers in terms of yield. It might be more cost effective to just invest in a rainwater catchment system than a drilled well. You end up having a cleaner source that's not affected by septic, as long as you have checks and balances in place to deal with bacteria from birds and stuff, and new growth in the system from organics. But the Salt Spring did a rainwater catchment manual that's really, really good, and it's based on the sort of Salt Spring specific example, but it's great for an island. And the RDN also, both of those resources are free. How to set up a drinking water system from rain, or an irrigation system from rain, depending on what you're wanting to do. So those are really good resources. Yeah.
Got a couple of Max.
Yeah, just double clicking on some of the climate change data, it seems to me, maybe you can correct this, that the mean or the trend that we derive from the averages, it's useful to see where we're headed over time, but also the extremes are pretty important, because if we have, an extremely dry period or an extra long drought period, then that's when we might get overdrawn wells, and then we get the saltwater intrusion, which is, as you say, a long time to reset. So it seems like that's maybe the or an additionally very important data point is like, what's the worst case scenario, that's sort of like 100-year drought for our area, how is that changing?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you see like with looking at the hydrographs, definitely like where there's been a longer period of record, we see that period when recharge occurs and when the curve starts going down, the groundwater level starts diminishing. In some areas, you see that happening earlier and earlier, and you see the groundwater levels where they would go to a certain point, maybe they're going deeper and deeper. And so if you have multiple years of drought on one another, like so you have a dry summer and then followed by a dry winter, and you haven't replenished those water supplies, then you can kind of have an additive effect, and that's also true with lake systems, for example. You know, so if they have a certain amount of free water, like above their intake or water availability, and then you have dry seasons on top of one another, then there's kind of not replenishing. That's where the monitoring is really key, because you can start seeing those trends. How deep are the groundwater levels going compared to, the long-term average? And the trends that, back to Cecil's comment about usually the province considers a minimum 10 years to try to build a trend, a reliable trend of what's happening. So I think that we are likely to see much longer, drier summers. That's, some of the climate models suggest that we will have wetter winters, but if we have higher rainfall intensity, then a greater proportion sometimes of the rainfall that does happen, it runs off the land surface and isn't able to infiltrate because it happens so fast, So all of those kind of patterns that will affect the water availability for sure. So I think it just speaks to the value of conservation and the need to be cautious about how we use the water.
Yeah, Carrie and then Matt. Oh, Carrie's right there.
I just wanted to clarify something you said because I always thought Quadra Sands meant that, our aquifer was connected to other large aquifers. And you're saying that everything that falls on our island is what recharges and it doesn't come from anywhere else. We're not like, okay. So then following on that, is there any research with regard to the impact of forest cover or retaining forest cover on groundwater recharge?
Yeah, I mean, that's a kind of a complex question because it also depends on the age of the trees and the soil characteristics and the slope, and as we talked about with the groundwater recharge potential mapping. Sometimes some studies have suggested, like say if you log, in the short term, you may have more groundwater recharge because the trees aren't there to intercept and utilize that water. And the land is more bare, and so there's more will infiltrate more. And then, but then if you reforest that area and the tree growth happens, then there could be a lag time, and then as the trees reach that kind of sort of they're starting to grow more, they'll start to use more of the water, and so you'll kind of have a rebound effect of less recharge depending on the age of the trees.
But maybe more
and then forests, so I think also we were thinking about watershed health. And this is not my area of expertise, but Beaufort Water Stewards and the Solon River watershed, they've done some studies about percent of the watershed logged and how that affects both water quality and quantity of flows and streams. And at UBC, Yuns Aliyah has been doing a lot of study about watershed health and kind of how much of the watershed logging, the percentage of the watershed that is logged, and also where in the watershed is logged has a really big impact on stream health and kind of water balance within the watershed. So I think, you know, maintaining forest cover has value, and also development wise, I mean, in urban areas, there's a lot of impervious cover, so you run into this, the water being funneled off the landscape before it's had a chance to infiltrate. So, you know, stormwater management that kind of tries to maintain that drainage, natural drainage condition, I think has value, rather than like lots of paving and impervious surface and storm, redirection of storm flows and things like that. So, it's probably in a low density development area like this, it's probably less of a concern, but certainly in urban areas, that the water balance is affected a lot by impervious surfaces.
Matt over there had his hand up.
Hey, I'm sorry if this has been touched on already, but I was curious to know if, human created, surface retention had any significant positive effect on infiltration. And, if our visible lake levels, have correlation to, the standard aquifer, level that could be relied upon.
Yeah, so those are both really good questions. So, one is around storage in the landscape. So some, I think there is some value in, you know, wetland retention, for example. So that allows the water to stay in place and infiltrate rather than kind of promoting that runoff, having kind of places on the landscape where water can sit and infiltrate. It has value. And, in terms of the lake level, I think that if we're thinking about a community monitoring network, having staff gauges on the lake or some kind of monitoring of lake levels that could be coupled with monitoring within wells near the lake would would be really helpful for us to understand the interrelationship between the surface and the groundwater. I don't think we have enough information at present to really piece that out, but there's, like I said, from the modeling point of view, it seems that likely that there's an interrelationship there. I think it would be useful to monitor, to try to understand that better.
One more question, if you don't mind. We have a clay hardpan layer above the sand aquifer, and so the assumption is that precipitation input will kind of slide down that downhill, recharge the lakes, and not necessarily really effectively infiltrate into the aquifer initially. Then just wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, and definitely there seems like there is suggestion that there could be kind of a perch system, and that could be the source of some of the springs or wetlands that are occurring above that hard pen. And as I say, like, I think that that the presence of that till layer could promote movement off the land surface of the water. That being said, that there could be variability in thickness and the permeability of that layer. So there's going to be potentially windows within it, or it may be thinner in some areas, or there can be fractures and fissures in that allow infiltration. So it's not like a, you know,
It's not entirely impermeable.
yeah, exactly. So it would allow some slower movement, store some water and allow some movement through it. And then also there'll be other mechanisms through which groundwater is going to be getting down into the aquifer, as well as potentially at the margins of the lake, or where surface water features like the lakes may have incised through that hill.
Matt, I think maybe before you came in, she had a couple of images that indicated that Hague Lake might be recharging the aquifer as in addition to spilling it over the creek. I think that's, if I understood that image right, that the connection between the lake is actually somehow connected to the aquifer down here.
That's what is suggested by the groundwater levels, and but the data that we have for groundwater levels is mainly from, measurements that were taken at the time of drilling. So we don't have like contemporary levels for comparison, but certainly, Dr. Alan Dakin, who's done some work for Rainbow Ridge, had suggested that like maybe a purge system, and definitely when we look at the modeling of cross sections of the aquifer, it does suggest so that the lake level being slightly higher and the groundwater table adjacent being somewhat lower, so you would expect groundwater to flow or water to flow from high to low level in low ground.
I just want to do a time check here. We're at 5 o'clock. We've all been sitting for 2 hours now, and Sylvia's been on the hot seat for that long. You want to ask the last question of the day?
Sure, I'm
Great.
just wondering, does the province have any recorded, seawater intrusion for Cortes Island? And the other question was, I remember going to Denman years ago and their water smelled like rotten eggs. What was that smell from? Was that from saltwater intrusion or?
No, well,
Or is that something different? But anyway, I just wondering, is there any actual recorded known wells on Cortes that the provincial government would have recorded?
well, the provincial government doesn't track saltwater intrusion.
Okay,
Okay,
just was wondering.
we are aware of some wells that potentially could be impacted, and certainly there's areas that are at risk because of, being, say, these fractured rock, the deeper wells close to the coast, and people were reporting salty conditions, sort of anecdotally.
Lee had a saltwater intrusion down at Cortes Bay.
Yeah.
They
Yes.
lost that well.
We live on Red Granite Road, and before we got there was a well that they had to abandon, and then they drilled another one further from the ocean.
Okay, so
So
probably
it's
the local
happened.
well drillers kind of know that information.
Yes.
I'm just curious if Cortes has had a lot of them happen or not. That's all. I guess we don't have data on it.
Doesn't sound like we have data.
Yeah, I mean, it's more anecdotal at this point, and I think that it could be examined further. But, and then in terms of the rotten egg smell, that's hydrogen sulfide that is produced by iron and iron reducing bacteria that are present, and it's often common in areas where there's more mature groundwater, older groundwater, and Denman and Hornby have the aquifer is a sedimentary bedrock, so it's very fewer fractures and smaller diameter fractures, so limited flow, and so there's less flux through the system, and so very low yielding wells, some of them, and so they're drilled down into deep zones where the water has had a lot of time to contact and dissolve minerals, and then there's those natural bacteria that that use the minerals as a food source, and then they produce the hydrogen sulfide. And so they can deal with that by filtering the water or aerating.
Right, I'm just grateful we haven't had that.
Yeah. But yeah, in certain areas where there's limited supply, that those conditions definitely can occur.
Thank you.
Huge thank you from our entire community to you and your team for great work. Really appreciate it. I did hand around a sign-in sheet. If you signed in, as the report is kind of ready for draft and comment, I'll send around the link on where to register your well, and be great to stay in touch and work together on some monitoring as an immediate outcome of today's conversation like that. That seems like a first step that we need to be pursuing, but lots more work to do. So thanks to everybody. Thank you all for being here. And thanks for your time.
No,
I just want to get.
Because I'm turning